Okay, so my talk tonight is called Marketing, It's All About the Strategy, but it has got another name, another title, or How Clear Thinking Makes Marketing Your Business More Effective and Easier, but obviously this one's much more snappy, so we thought we kind of dispense with that one. But it is about that, it's about making your marketing easier and more enjoyable and much more effective, just by the very fact of having a clear strategy. My name's Jo Rees. I'm a director at Salt Media, and I'm a kind of marketeer by background, really. I've worked for the BBC for a long time in London and Sydney, marketing DVDs and books and magazines and things. And then now at Salt Media, I look after the marketing for the clients, do lots of the thinking with people like Anne, and I've got kind of, qualifications and things like the Chartered Institute of Marketing and things. That's what I've been doing for quite a long time. And the reason I wanted to talk about this, really, of all kind of marketing subjects, is something I just feel really strongly about, that the best marketing comes from just a bit of clear thinking. That's what it's all about. And if you start off with the thinking, then everything else just falls out, and it just makes sense. Otherwise, you end up having a kind of scattergun kind of approach, really, where you're doing a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of this, responding very often to different opportunities that arise, or a need in the short term to, oh God, I've got to get more bums on seats in the restaurant, or quick, I need to get more people into the shop, or I need to get more clients. And you end up trying lots of different things, and actually, you always have to kind of rethink those things all the time. Rethink every time that you do something, which is incredibly time consuming, very difficult to do. It takes a huge amount of time. Ultimately, it's expensive because you're always trying different kinds of approaches and hoping that one of them you'll get it right. And I think the importance of having this kind of talk with a group like Joined Up is that most of us are owners of businesses or decision makers within small businesses. And so actually what happens is we end up spending time doing everything every day. So we're thinking about the finances, we're thinking about distribution, about recruitment, we're thinking about the marketing, we're thinking about logistics, loads of things. And you're constantly being asked to jump from one thing to another thing to another thing. And then somehow, miraculously, out of all that, just pluck some fabulous marketing strategy and kind of say, right, and now I know what to do. And then when somebody, in the organisation says, I know, why don't we get really heavily into social media, you're supposed to somehow have a thought there and then as to whether this is a good idea or not, because it's impossible. You haven't got time in the day to think about that. Or should be advertising this publication, or should we be, rebuilding a website? So by having a really good strategy, a really clear strategy, all of a sudden you don't feel bad about turning down opportunities, because you know if they fit, and if they don't fit, then that's fine, you can let them go, and if they do fit, then brilliant, you're on the right track and you're doing the right thing. So it just makes everything so much easier. And that's your kind of that's your sort of sense check, really. So although it takes a bit of time to obviously put together a strategy, it's time, I think, that pays dividends in terms of what happens on the day-to-day in your business. So this is my kind of in a nutshell guide to putting together a strategy, and some of the things you need to think about. So I brought along Doctor Who with me, because he's my little analogy for what is the best analogy I could think of for putting together a marketing strategy. I was doing this with my son the other day, and it occurred to me that actually jigsaw puzzles are exactly what they're like putting together a marketing strategy. You're constantly looking at all the different pieces, and it's only when you start to put them together and a picture starts to appear, and you start to get some clarity, and very often out of that sort of thinking, out of getting it down on paper, because it's not brain surgery, it's stuff that very often about your business, but it's just taking the time to get it all done on paper, and out of that real clarity ensues, and you often get that little light bulb moment of thinking, oh God, well, clearly there's a direction here we could take, or clearly there's a gap in the market here we could follow. How come we didn't think about this before, just because you're so busy doing everything else, and this just feels like another thing to do. So the kind of things that I would think about, I would just sort of recommend thinking about when starting a strategy, is starting off, big picture, and thinking about the things that are going on out there in the wider world, thinking about what's happening in the political situation, changes in legislation, for example, how they might affect and change how people will use your product or your service. what's happening in the economy, and it's similarly how that, how that's changing, how people use your business and service. Social trends. So, for example, we publish a food magazine. It's clear that more and more people are using, reading magazines online. Be mad to ignore it. Those kind of trends, must be kind of built into your marketing strategy from the beginning. Same with technology, changing all the time. So, I think Rees of business like yours with making signs, the technology and the ability to create something bigger and better. Every so often there must be those kind of leaps where all of a sudden you can make massive things that before you couldn't do that. And then that opens you up to a different market, doesn't it? So technology is really important. Then I think it's helpful you start to kind of bring it a little bit closer to home and look at what your competitors are doing. So not just the wider kind of competitors, but especially the key competitors that you're most directly competing with. Who are they? What are they doing? How do they speak to the consumers? What kind of tone do they have? What do they look like? What's the offer? What's the price? All that kind of thing. Again, you probably know a lot of that, but getting it on paper does really help to get some clarity in terms of what they're doing and what you're doing, and where there's a gap maybe and where there are opportunities. Also useful to think about price versus differentiation. So, where are you in the market? Do you sell on price, or do you sell? Do people buy from you because you're cheaper, like Morrison's, for example, or do they buy from you like Waitrose because you're better, perceived to be better, and therefore people will pay more for the product? Understanding that and within the kind of your group of competitors is really important. Also, of course, your target market, another thing, understanding them, what they do, who they are, how they behave, where do they live, how do they speak to each other, what channels do they use, when do they use those channels? Again, a lot of that stuff you all know, but getting it on paper starts to create some real clarity. And then the classic marketing things to look at in terms of product and price and placement of your product, promotion, what promotions you do, what promotions your competitors do. All of those kind of things, you just start to get that little magic moment when the light bulb goes off and it becomes clear that there's a direction that would be really sensible, for you to take. And then you start to get that clarity and you start to understand what your USPs are, and you start to think about, okay, right, so it's clear, we should be, this should be our message, and we should be talking to these people in this way at this time, using this kind of language and using these kind of visuals, because these are the things that that get our customers going. This is what speaks to them. So, for example, if your target audience are 14-year-old boys, or teenage boys, I should say, then clearly they spend such a huge amount of time online in any 24 hours. You need to be using the internet probably almost exclusively to market to them. But if you're marketing to retirees who clearly do use the internet but nowhere near in the same amount that teenagers do, then you've got then you're going to use some different thing. And I say it's really quite simple in a funny sort of way, but it's just kind of doing the thinking about it. And I think you don't have to do this with an agency. You can do it within your team. I think you should do it within your team. If you've got a big enough team, that's really helpful, because often people will have some great ideas that you may not even know about. Working in different parts of the business, they'll bring creative and interesting ideas. You should also, ask people that you know and that you trust, whether they're kind of mentors or friends who are maybe in a similar business that's maybe not, not a competitor. There'll be lots of people, I think, if you think creatively, that could be very good people to bounce these ideas off. That would be helpful to help you kind of do this thinking. But I would say don't do it alone. It's almost impossible to do it alone, because you just can't. You get stuck in that. Oh, we do it this way. We've always done it this way. And having other people ask the right kind of questions starts to free your mind to think, oh yeah, there are other ways of doing this. We could do it differently. And of course, once you've got your strategy, it doesn't stay there. It doesn't stay like frozen, in aspic or whatever, set in aspic forever. It changes, and you have to change it sporadically. But I would get that alone can make it feel a bit all off-putting, like, oh God, another document. I've got to try and keep up to date every week, and more typing out, and it's all a bit onerous. I think it's just keep it as a kind of living idea, so that you've got something you can set and check against. This is who we are. This is what we're trying to achieve. This is how we're going to try and do it. Then it becomes a useful, helpful, kind of friendly thing rather than just another thing on the to-do list that needs to be ticked off. So to use my kind of puzzle analogy, you know, life is a bit of a puzzle, but I don't think marketing has to be, if you've got a good strategy to help you, a good clear strategy to help you sort of steer a good course. That's me for you.